The Allied invasion of Normandy was one of the most complex military operations ever conducted. Thousands of ships and planes had to work in conjunction with tens of thousands of soldiers who had to do one of the most difficult things in all of warfare, an amphibious landing. In addition to all the planning that went into the invasion, there were many unknowns. The only way to learn was to practice some of the elements of the landing. In April 1944, about 6 weeks before D-Day, the Allies conducted a practice exercise off the coast of England, and it turned into one of the biggest disasters of the war. Learn more about Exercise Tiger and the disastrous rehearsal for D-Day on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily.
Want a website with unmatched power, speed, and control? Try Bluehost Cloud, the new web hosting plan from Bluehost, built for WordPress creators by WordPress experts. With 100% uptime, incredible load times, and 24/7 WordPress priority support, your site will be lightning fast with global reach. And with Bluehost Cloud, your sites can handle surges in traffic no matter how big. Plus, you automatically get daily backups and world-class security. Get started now at Bluehost.com.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Warriors in Their Own Words, a podcast that presents the unvarnished, unsanitized truth of what we have asked of those who defend this nation. As a country, we need these stories more than ever. Stories from Americans who have borne the battle, including 30-year-old remastered interviews with veterans from World War I recounting their time in the trenches of Europe, and with veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and from our most recent conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other battlefields Americans may never have heard of. Hear their stories by listening to Warriors in Their Own Words wherever you find podcasts.
When we tell the story of D-Day, we think back with the benefit of hindsight. We know how everything worked out. The Allies landed, had some initial setbacks, but eventually broke through and opened up a second front in the war, which helped liberate Western Europe and defeat Nazi Germany. However, going into D-Day, there was a great deal of doubt about the operation's success. There had never been an amphibious landing on this scale before, and there had never been an airborne assault of that scale. The Allies didn't know what the weather would be, the exact state of the beaches they'd be landing on, and how reinforced that section of the German Atlantic Wall would be. Many of those things could only be discovered on the day of the invasion. Other things, however, could be practiced beforehand. In the months and weeks before D-Day, the Allies conducted a series of training exercises off the southern coast of England. In 1943, the British government set up an area that was to be used for the training of Force U. Force U was to be the group that would land at Utah Beach. The area was known as Slapton Sands in Devon. Over 3,000 locals had to be evacuated, both for security and safety reasons, as live ammunition would be used in some of the exercises. Slapton Sands was selected because it was similar to Utah Beach, where they would be landing, as it had a gravel beach. The idea behind the training exercises was sound. You didn't want to conduct one of the most important military operations of the war with thousands of troops that had never had to do an amphibious landing before. Certain things can only be learned by doing, especially because many of the ships that would be used, the LSTs or landing ship tanks, were relatively new designs built during the war. Before I get into the specifics of Exercise Tiger, I should note that most training exercises for D-Day were conducted without incident. Practice landings actually began as early as December 1943. Exercise Tiger was to be a practice landing with troops from the U.S. Army's 1st Engineer Special Brigade, the 4th Infantry Division, and a smattering of other units. It was to be one of the biggest exercises in the lead-up to D-Day. Exercise Tiger was scheduled to take place from April 22nd to April 30th, 1944. 23,000 units that were to participate in D-Day were spread out at assembly points all over southern England. They were to assemble and load their ships just as they would on D-Day. The first practice landing on the beach took place on the morning of April 27th. While this practice landing isn't actually the core of the episode, it had its own disastrous problems. General Eisenhower wanted the rehearsal landings to be as realistic as possible. As such, the ships would fire live rounds on the beach before the landing and over the shoulders' heads as they approached the shore. The landing was scheduled to take place at 7:30 a.m. However, several of the LSTs were late leaving port, so the admiral in charge of the operation, Don Moon, decided to delay the landing until 8:30 a.m. However, not all of the landing craft were informed of the change because the radios were operating at different frequencies. So they started their landings at the original 7:30 a.m. The plan was for the landing to take place 1 hour after the naval bombardment. The British ships that were to fire the live rounds at the updated time accidentally ended up firing on the soldiers who were landing at the original time. 110 American soldiers were killed by friendly fire. You can find varying estimates for the number killed. I've read estimates as high as 600, but one of the reasons for the confusion is that the incident wasn't disclosed to the press or the public because of the secrecy before D-Day. However, research conducted after the war conclusively put the number at 110. Most of those killed came from a single company that landed just 3 minutes before the barrage began. This, however, was not the worst thing that was going to happen during Exercise Tiger. An even worse incident was to take place in less than 24 hours. Despite the friendly fire incident, the exercise continued. That evening on April 27th, a group of ships, which was dubbed Convoy T4, which included 8 LSTs, were packed with soldiers, mostly from the U.S. Army 1st Engineer Special Brigade. I should explain exactly what the LSTs were. Landing Ship Tanks, or LSTs, were amphibious warfare ships used extensively during World War II. These vessels were designed to transport large numbers of vehicles, troops, and equipment directly onto shore without the need for docks or piers. Each LST was about 328 feet or 100 meters long and could travel at a speed of about 10 knots. They could carry up to 20 Sherman tanks or around 2,100 tons of cargo along with hundreds of troops. These were significantly larger than the Landing Craft Vehicles and Personnel, or LCVPs, which could carry about 36 infantry and appear in most movies about D-Day. The LSTs were much larger amphibious vehicles that arrived on the beaches after the first waves landed. The LSTs were used in the Pacific and the Solomon Islands, as well in Europe in the invasions of Sicily, the Italian Peninsula, Normandy, and southern France. So when Convoy T4 set out on the evening of April 27th, these large LSTs were filled with hundreds of soldiers each. There were problems right from the start. The Allies had only assigned 2 ships to protect the entire convoy, and one of them didn't even show up because it had hit an LST earlier that evening and went into port for repairs. That left the HMS Azalea, a small corvette, as the only protection for the convoy that night. The other ship that wasn't present was a much larger destroyer, the HMS Scimitar. Not long after midnight, April 28th, 6 E-boats of the German 5th E-boat flotilla came across the ships. And here I should explain what E-boats are, because most people probably aren't familiar with them. In German, they were known as Schnellboote, which simply means fast boats. The term E-boat was an Allied designation for the boats created by the British. The E simply stood for enemy. The Germans called them S-boats. E-boats with a sleek, streamlined hull were designed for speed and maneuverability. They could reach speeds up to 43 knots, or about 80 kilometers per hour or 50 miles per hour, making them amongst the fastest naval vessels at the time. E-boats were typically armed with torpedoes, making them deadly against larger ships, and their American equivalent was the PT boat. Much of the German naval defenses in the Atlantic before D-Day were E-boats because they were fast, cheap, and effective. Several days earlier, on April 25th, German reconnaissance aircraft flew past the southern coast of England. They saw the military buildup that was taking place, but they didn't know what its purpose was. Word was sent to the German Navy to watch for activity off the coast of Devon. On the morning of April 28th, the Germans didn't know what was going on or that the Allies were rehearsing for the invasion of France. They just saw some easy targets in Lyme Bay. The commander of the German ships, Bernd Klug, ordered his 6 ships to split up into 3 groups of 2. The British had actually seen the ships from a distance. However, just as what happened in the previous morning, the British and American ships were using different radio frequencies. Moreover, word was sent to the HMS Azalea, who was ordered to do nothing and didn't want to draw attention to the convoy. A little after 1:30 a.m., the German E-boats attacked, opening up with their guns using tracer rounds at night. And a little after 2 a.m., things became chaotic. A torpedo hit LST-507, and one of the E-boats actually careened into it. This caused an explosion and a fire aboard the LST. Men began jumping overboard to avoid the fire into the cold waters of the Atlantic. One of the problems with the fire is that the trucks that were loaded onto the LSTs were all filled with fuel, again to keep conditions similar to what they would experience on D-Day. As the fire spread, the fuel from all the vehicles began to burn. Soon after that, 2 torpedoes hit LST-531 and another torpedo hit LST-289. LST-496 began using what little defenses it had to fire, but in the process, it ended up hitting LST-511 with friendly fire. By 3:30 a.m., the Battle of Lime Bay was over. LST-507 and 531 were both sunk within minutes of being hit. 202 men were lost on LST-507, and 424 were lost on LST-531. The rest of the ships that were hit managed to limp back home with some fatalities. In total, from the torpedo attacks and the friendly fire incident earlier in the day, in less than 24 hours, Exercise Tiger witnessed the loss of 749 American servicemen. Because of the operation secrecy, the entire incident was unknown until it became public in the 1960s. There were enormous implications that came out of the disaster of April 27th and 28th. For starters, there were 10 American commanders who were lost who had top-level clearance and knew the plans for the invasion. If they had been captured, the entire operation would have been put on hold. Eisenhower ordered the bodies of the 10 men to be found to ensure that they weren't captured or could jeopardize the operation. Radio frequencies were standardized before D-Day, so there wouldn't be a repeat of the errors from Exercise Tiger. Better life preserver training was given to the soldiers that would be in the amphibious craft, and smaller boats were assigned to pick up soldiers in the water during the landing on D-Day. They also increased the aerial and naval bombardments of Cherbourg in France, where the German fleet in Normandy was headquartered, in an attempt to destroy as many E-boats as possible before the landing started. In one of the most ironic twists of the entire episode, the men involved in the exercises were all part of Force U who were to land on Utah Beach. On D-Day, there were only 197 casualties on Utah Beach, meaning that the losses from Exercise Tiger for Force U exceeded the D-Day losses by over threefold. Because of the operation secrecy, nothing was done to honor those who died after the war. It wasn't until much later that memorials were erected in their honor. A Devon resident by the name of Ken Small took it upon himself to create a memorial near Slapton Sands. There's a plaque in Arlington National Cemetery and also one on Utah Beach in France. And there are additional memorials in the towns of Mexico, Missouri, and New Bedford, Massachusetts. Exercise Tiger is a significant, although tragic, episode in the lead-up to D-Day, highlighting the immense changes and the steep cost of preparing for one of the most critical operations of the Second World War. And while it was a costly lesson, from the events of Operation Tiger, the Allies were able to modify their plans for the invasion of Normandy, which may have saved the lives of hundreds to thousands. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Benji Long and Cameron Kieffer. I want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon, including the show's producers. Your support helps me put out a show every single day. And also, Patreon is currently the only place where Everything Everywhere Daily merchandise is available to the top tier of supporters. If you'd like to talk to other listeners of the show and members of the Completionist Club, you can join the Everything Everywhere Daily Facebook group or Discord server. Links to everything are in the show notes.